and welcome back to Sunday Reads with Renee here at Simply Renee. My name is Renee. I'd like to thank everyone who has liked, shared, commented, subscribed, and clicked the notification bell to my channel. I truly appreciate it as it helps me to grow. For this week's segment of Sunday Reads with Renee, I'm going to be recommending 5 book recommendations of nonfiction works about the American Revolution, or at least a relation to it. And when I originally planned to do this video, I had quite a long list, including 10 of them, and I decided just to focus on 5 of them because I find the American Revolution subject matters can be very broad. It can be anything from political to military to social and everything else in between. And so I'm just going to focus on 5 books and then leave you a recommendation list towards the end of the video. But before I begin, I'd like to say that I am going to be revealing plot details, therefore spoilers are ahead, and also I'm going to be using different types of alternative words and phrases due to YouTube rules and regulations. Standing in Their Own Light by Judith L. Van Buskirk. Now, this is a 2017 nonfiction work that goes into detail as much as possible about the Black Patriots who fought for the American independence. In this case, the African Americans who were part of the Continental Army. There were 5,000 African Americans that were part of the Continental Army in the fight for American independence and freedom to overthrow the British Empire, but also get their own personal emancipation as well as their equality. And what the author does do very well, she tries to give as much of a broad historical narrative possible on the Black Patriots who fought for the American independence. Unfortunately, she does acknowledge, as is not uncommon in research and history, that there isn't a lot to really go on. Unfortunately, of those 5,000 men who fought for American independence, only 500 could really go off of in this book research to give a historical narrative because it had more information on it. Nonetheless, the author does a good job of really trying to put as much as possible in this short nonfiction work. And what she does is that she goes into a lot of detail about why these individuals were part of the Continental Army. Some were free blacks and others were enslaved, and they had this idea of trying to really fight for American independence because they saw it as their platform for liberty and these ideas, but also they saw it as their own way of not just overthrowing the British Empire, but also fighting for equality and personal emancipation for themselves. Now, what happens is that they join the army, they fight for American independence. There is good chapters on Rhode Island, where I'm from, where we talk about the Black regiments that were here and what we're honoring more this year here in my town. And it's a very good one to really look at because it gives a lot of detail about this Black regiment and how hard they fought for American independence and the contributions they made. But it also focuses on the tragic side to this, in which the aftermath of the Revolutionary War didn't honor or celebrate the Black Patriots the way they should have. Now, what happened is that these Black Patriots fought for American independence, but there was a long-held fight to be getting their contributions, their acknowledgments, and more importantly, their pensions, because they're saying, hey, we were soldiers who fought very hard for this American independence like everyone else, and therefore we have a right to get our pensions. There were enslaved people who fought for it in an effort to get personal emancipation and this idea of American freedom, but were still kept in enslavement, and some who really struggled to be free and get personal emancipation even thereafter, whether they served as soldiers or something else. And so there were those long-held beliefs of American independence ingrained in them, but they still didn't really find the rewards for it. No rewards and contributions and honors for their hard work as soldiers, their fight for American independence, the struggles to get their pensions, the struggles to even get their freedom and be seen as equals. So there is a tragic side to this, but nonetheless, there is a good historical narrative here in Standing in Your Own Light, which does talk a lot about the Black Patriot side and why I'm glad this year we're talking more about it than ever before. I think these individuals deserve to be honored and celebrated for all their sacrifices just as anyone else. And even here in Rhode Island, we've recently passed legislation to give a belated Congressional Medal of Honor to Rhode Island's Black Regiment to honor them, which I'm very pleased by as a history lover and recent member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. I believe these individuals should be honored, celebrated, researched, and held to the highest esteem for all their sacrifices. So this is a good book to research, and I'll leave some links in the description as well so you can read up on yourself and also just learn more about it, because this is one that I really think should be read and looked into and researched more. Revolutionary Mothers by Carol Berkin. As a fan of Carol Berkin's work for a long time, Revolutionary Mothers is a very good one. Published in 2006, this nonfiction work focuses on a more broader historical narrative of women who contributed to America's independence in some way, shape, or form. Now, one of the things about the book is that Berkin does acknowledge that there are more famous names that we associate with the American independence and Revolutionary War. Abigail Adams and Betsy Ross make the list, but it doesn't really focus a lot on the unsung women of the American Revolution, which is what Berkin tries to put in this narrative as much as possible with Revolutionary Mothers. And I do appreciate that because I think there is a more broader historical narrative we can tell about the women who may not have the same type of clout as Abigail Adams and Betsy Ross, even Martha Washington, but nonetheless contributed to American independence in some way, shape, or form. And what Berkin does is she tries to give as much of a historical narrative as possible through the research she found on hand in 2006. And more research has been done, of course, since then. But in 2006, from the research she had, she talked a lot about the camp wives, the ones who went on these camps with the American troops to try and really do everything they could with chores and cooking and helping the men, assisting them when they're sick, and also doing a lot on women who were spies or trying to fight for the independent cause, working on the home front, even with the dangers that came where British troops could come in and do a lot of significant, tragic, bloody damage. And there's also focus on African Americans and the indigenous Native American, even though there isn't a lot of information to go on, to which Berkin acknowledges is because there isn't a lot that she could find at the time, and there's still a struggle to do that because a lot, unfortunately, wasn't left behind. Unfortunately, no memoirs, notes, diaries, and biographies, so what we have is what we have, and more research going forward might tell us more broader, different stories, or even similar stories in a more broader context. But nonetheless, Revolutionary Mothers is a good one because it really does do a good job of focusing on those historical narratives. She also does focus too on women who were soldiers or contributed to the army in some way, including ones who built up women's brigades and really tried to help on that front as well. We're familiar with Deborah Sampson, but there are other women who contributed as well. And there's one in particular called Margaret Corbin, who took her husband's place beside a cannon at Fort Monmouth. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But basically, these women were involved in so many different types of broad, different parts and aspects of the Revolutionary War. And there is a tragic side that Berkin talks about in which, despite their contributions, little was left to really honor, celebrate, or acknowledge them in the aftermath, and why there has been such a struggle for them to still do that even today, even though we're trying to do it more. And in this case, they fought for American independence, but weren't necessarily seen as equals. They were in their own way left out of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. For anyone who is familiar with Abigail Adams, she wrote that famous letter to her husband John, Remember the Ladies. But there also is the tragic side to which women were not acknowledged, but especially women of color were hardly and never acknowledged for their contributions as well. So what Revolutionary Mothers tries to do is really bring that to the more general public to have thought-provoking discussion, learn more information, and of course do their own research. So this is something I recommend, not just because I'm a Carol Berkin fan, because I also think she is a great writer. She really is someone that is interested and passionate about the subject matter. Having seen her in a lecture back in March 2026, I can really tell that she's still animated and still loves her work. And it was such a great pleasure to see her in this lecture and hear her and listen to her. And I do recommend this book, and I think you will enjoy it to learn more about the women of the American Revolution, but also do your own research as well. The Great Contradiction by Joseph Ellis. And this is a short nonfiction work that really has more thought-provoking discussion than anything else, which is what Ellis says he's trying to do in the beginning chapters, and that is quite true. A lot of what he presents is the great things about America's founding, but also wanting us to look at the tragic sides of it as well, which I think is important. You can't talk about the American Revolution or history in general without looking at the positives and negatives and the in-between, and something that everyone should discuss as much as possible. In the case of the Great Contradiction, it's focusing more on America's founding, these great ideals about freedom, liberty, and equality, but at the same time, it's not applying to everyone. In this case, it didn't apply to women, but it also doesn't apply to Native Americans who are indigenous to their homelands on American soil, and enslavement, in particular the enslavement of people of color. Now, for Ellis, what he does is that he starts off with the basic history of it in the beginning chapters and then goes through a chronological order up until the end where America is founded and talking a little bit more about the aftermath. But in this case, he tries to talk as much as he can about the indigenous removal as well as enslavement because those are the most important subjects he really wanted to talk about. But he also acknowledges that there isn't as much research as he could find on the indigenous removal as he could on enslavement. Therefore, enslavement is more of a focus of the book than anything else, even though he does discuss indigenous rights that were not enshrined or held, and how that there is a tragedy of the fact that indigenous people were removed off their homelands, which was their birthplace and their homelands and where they had been for thousands of years. And they also talk too about enslavement and how that was a very big subject matter, even going into the Revolutionary War. He discusses in the beginning chapters how even in the 1750s and 1760s, political talks were being discussed very frequently in the American soil, in which they talked a lot about enslavement, where patriots are saying, no, we can't have slavery here, it's wrong, and the British Empire is wrong to have it. And at the same time, you have loyalists contradicting them, saying, don't you realize your own hypocrisy because you're keeping enslavement and some of you own people as property, so what are you talking about and who are you to judge us? So there is that discussion happening in the 1750s and 1760s, even beyond that as well. But this is one that I do recommend because I think, again, it's important to talk about the positives and negatives of any type of history, especially the American Revolutionary War. And something that a lot of people have done over the years, especially the last few years and even this year, is talk more about everyone who contributed to the American Revolution in some way, shape, or form, acknowledging those positives as well as those negatives. And what I think Ellis does well is really create what he set out to do, which is thought-provoking discussion, where it does make you think about a lot of things. It even made me think about it a little bit more through this book about the ideas of the Constitution and what we were fighting for, in which I believe we were right to fight for these ideals and this importance, but at the same time, there was a tragic side to it. Not just in the fact that we had to break away from the British Empire and a bloody conflict over it, but also the fact that we didn't include everyone. We didn't include women, we didn't include indigenous tribes, we didn't include people of color. We kept enslavement intact for many, many decades that still had very negative effects even after it was ended and people were emancipated, because we still had Jim Crow laws and so many other segregationist laws that we're still battling with even today. Same with indigenous rights. We're still battling with that even today, and I believe that everyone should have their rights and they should have equality. These are still things we're talking about and discussing. And what Ellis tries to do too is that when they established the Declaration of Independence, they actually left those matters unresolved because they were fighting for a nation, wanting to push it through as fast as quickly, but leaving all of that unresolved for future generations to figure out, and we still are. But I do appreciate this book and do recommend it because I think it is a good one to read in relation to the American Revolution. American Revolutionist by Alan Taylor. And this is one I debated about putting in the recommendation list because I'm not a huge fan of Alan Taylor's work, but nonetheless, I do think he is a very good historian and he writes very well. And I do think this book overall gives the most of what I feel, in my own opinion, the broader context of the American Revolution from its origins up until the early Republic of 1804, which is what he tries to do in this book of really re-examining the American Revolution, its founding, its aftermath, and its beginnings. And I think he overall does a very good job. He focuses a lot on as much perspective as he can through the primary sources and secondary sources he has on hand. And he really does give that broad complex about focusing on how, even though there were these great ideas about America's founding and wanting to create independence and all these types of liberties and such that everyone could enjoy, there were these downsides to it in which we aren't really sharing the same type of equality with women and men of color and women of color. We're keeping people enslaved, and we're also expanding, which is great and also bad in many ways. And we're removing Indians off their land. stand, and we're pitting people against each other. It focuses a lot too on the Patriot side, but also the Loyalist side, which isn't really discussed too much from a lot of the books on the Revolutionary War I go into. So having more of the British Loyalist side there, I thought was very important. But it also talks about all the conflicts and the battles and how allies have to choose between each other at times and the negative aspects. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on here in this book that I think gives a very broad, complex look at the entire history of the American Revolutionary War, from its origins up until the aftermath into the early Republic, but also how all these types of situations, conflicts, and discussions, as well as these downsides and these positives and negatives, really helped shape the early founding of America and established ourselves until 1804, where thereafter we had to figure more stuff out completely. So I think he does make a very good assessment of everything, and because it is such a big, thick book, it's a lot to talk about, which will take us a while here. It's about a little more than 700 pages, but I do think it is a good overall book to really give you that broad look at American revolutionists in every shape and form, and how it does shape us even after the Revolutionary War ends, and how it continues to shape us even after the early Republic in 1804. The American Revolution: A History by Gordon S. Wood. This 2003 book recommendation from me comes on the heels of Wood's passing just in early 2026. He's someone that I read in college and outside of it. So rest well, and Gordon S. Wood, and thank you so much for everything you wrote and contributed to history, especially the early American Republic as well as American Revolution. There are a lot of great Gordon S. Wood books out there that are nonfiction that you can really enjoy, but I decided to do this one on the American Revolution: A History because I do think it is a good, short, concise format to really look over and understand more of the political side of founding a nation and these ideas that the revolutionists and founding fathers had. And I do think Wood does a good job with it, but it does come from a more idealistic dreamer side than anything else. But nonetheless, I think it is important to recommend this book to read because just as good as it is to know the broad context of the American Revolution, whether that's the negative, the mixed, or even the positive, knowing about what we were fighting for is important to do so. And what these founding fathers were fighting for, as discussed in Wood's book, was trying to establish an entire 13 original colonies to really come together to creating something that they could all agree on compared to what they experienced under the British Crown. And so it was a long, hard fight they did, discussing a lot about what they needed to establish the Constitution, why George Washington re-enters political life, even though he was ready to just retire and move on. But it also discusses the goals, dreams, aspirations, and ideals they were thinking about in terms of politics, establishing a nation, and creating something with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and more. So there was a positive to the founding of the American Revolution and America itself to really get rid of the British Crown, try to establish our own ideals and goals, and really get there. And I think Gordon S. Wood does a good job of really going into it. But the problem is it's a very short, concise work where I think it's a more broader context that there could have been in more detail about it. But nonetheless, I do appreciate this work and recommend it because it does show more about that political side and how it wasn't easy to not just fight to establish independence, but to also the aftermath of founding a nation, really contributing these ideals we fought for to establish it in writing through our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and more, and having these general arguments about what's best. You have some colonies that don't want the same things as other colonies, so you have to really find common ground and push and figure out these ideals as much as possible, and what is the best way to really establish this new nation, to get rid of that imperial system, to create a less imperial system. So I do think Gordon S. Wood does a good job with this one and do recommend it along with his other works. And this concludes the 5 book recommendations, and I hope you will pick up and read them if you haven't yet. But this is a list of all the other recommendations. Those are all the recommendations here in this video. Now tell me what you think. Do you agree with me, not agree with me? Have you read these works, not read these works? What are your opinions on them? What other books can you recommend in regards to the American Revolution, whether it's the origins, in the middle, the aftermath, or different types of subject matters? Please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear all discussions. I thank you again so much for tuning in. Please be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell. I'll be back on next Sunday with this time a double book review of two American Revolutionary type nonfiction works, just in time for the 250th anniversary of America's founding. But I'll also be back on Wednesday with a random video, Friday with a food video, and some more shorts in between. Unfortunately, I've been a little lax in that due to some unexpected circumstances coming this past week, but I will be putting up more shorts. I thank you again so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye.